Well, welcome back, Master Gardener newbies. Hopefully part one of Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener wasn't too boring. Let's hope part two is more exciting, maybe, for some of you. So, there are two classes of plants out there. We have gymnosperms. They don't produce fruit, but they have what is called naked seeds. These are in cones. Think of a cone-bearing plant like conifers, pines, cycads, and other plants like that. All are woody and perennial, and usually they're evergreens. Usually. Then the larger of the two groups of plants are the angiosperms. These are truly the flowering plants of the plant world. Now, sometimes they don't always have pretty petals like you see in the lower right-hand picture, but they flower in some way, shape, or form. They may lack petals in some cases. The seeds are always in a fruit. Now, the fruit may not be sweet whatsoever. Think of acorns on our oak trees. They're not sweet at all. And then within that, for you lumpers, this is starting to get a little technical for you, and you probably are going, ooh, more divisions. And you splitters are finding this to be nirvana for you. And within the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, we have monocots and we have dicots. Monocots is short for monocotyledon. I won't expect you to remember that. And dicots is short for dicotyledons. I'll explain a little bit more in a while. So monocots versus dicots. Dicots are greater in number on the planet. There's about 165 known species of dicots or dicotyledonous plants. They could be woody or they may be herbaceous. Here's how you can tell if it's a dicot. When it first is planted, that seed, it'll come up and the first leaves that come up are what is called the seed leaves. And there'll be two of them if it's a dicot, because di means two and cot or cotyledons means leaves. So these plants, when you plant them, will put out two leaves at first, the seed leaves. That's ahead of the true leaves, which will look different than the seed leaves. They either have 4 to 5 petals in arrangement, but sometimes there's more. We've kind of talked about that a little bit with some of the hybridization and man selecting for various characteristics in plants. The veins of a dicot are netted. In other words, they kind of crisscross one another throughout the surface of the leaf, and I'll show some pictures in a moment. I don't particularly like this term defined or definite, but their vascular system is in a ring. Think about how you've heard over your life and times, this oak tree is 458 years old. Well, how do we know it's 458 years old? None of us was around unless somebody wrote down a record of when it was planted in Williamsburg or Jamestown or something like that. It's because when we cut them down, we can count the growth rings, and each ring represents a year of growth. Now, monocots or monocotyledons are fewer in number on the planet Earth, about 50,000 known species. They're usually herbaceous. There are a few rare woody ones, but we won't talk about that in great detail in this class. When you plant a monocot or monocotyledon, mono, one, cot or cotyledon, one seed leaf. In other words, you plant it and up will come one leaf only at first. Their flowers are usually in threes or multiples of threes. Their veins are parallel, and I'll show some pictures in a minute. Their vascular system is different. It is not defined in that ring, but it's a complex arrangement and it's scattered throughout the stem. I like to think of it as kind of like pepperoni is on a pizza. So here in reverse, kind of what you saw from the last slide, is a monocot seedling, and when you plant it, and it sure looks like a corn to me, corn seed being planted, and one leaf will come up. Look at the veins, how they're going just up and down the leaf surface in a straight or parallel lines. Now, if you look on the right-hand side of this picture, you'll see a dicot or dicotyledon. And you can see it looks kind of like a bean because it's some kind of a bean. And when a bean sprouts, the first two leaves that come up are called the seed leaves, and there will be two of them on a dicot. So here's a monocot or monocotyledon. The leaves of the veins. Look at the right hand side of the screen with the picture. Notice those veins are very prominent and they're parallel. If you remember back to your geometry, two lines of space are parallel if and only if they never cross one another. And if you're looking at that, you're probably thinking, gee, that looks kind of like some kind of lily, or maybe a crinum lily, or an amaryllis, or maybe even a wide blade of grass, or maybe it's from a leaf from corn. All those are monocots that I just mentioned. So that is one division of our flowering plants. Knowing the vein structure will help ease you into identifying weeds for weed control when we talk about turf. Then we have dicots. Sometimes we'll use the term broadleaf plants when we talk about dicots. Now, I just want to make clear that even though it may be a broad leaf, doesn't mean it has to be a large leaf at all. It could be as small as your little fingernail. But notice the veins on these two various plants that we have here. The left-hand side looks like a maple. It is a maple. The other one looks more like an elm to me, but it's a little hard to tell with only one leaf attached to that stem. But notice that the veins do cross one another at some point in space. That means they're not parallel, or we call it netted or net-like in their pattern. But again, broadleaf does not mean it's necessarily a wide leaf blade whatsoever. So here's a cross section of a monocot stem, Zea maves in this case. You may know it as corn. And if you see the scattered bundles that have been highlighted, they've been stained with specific colors of staining material so you can see it better. But these are the vascular tissue bundles of a monocot stem. Notice it's kind of scattered around the stem throughout, from the edge of the stem all the way practically into the center of the tissue. So kind of reminds me of pepperoni on a pizza. Why could this be important as a master gardener? Let's say somebody calls you up as a master gardener and says, somebody hit my palm tree with a weed whacker and went all the way around and went zzz. Would that harm the plant or kill it? It might harm it a bit. Potential for disease to get in, yes, but it won't sever all the conductive tissue. So the plant will probably survive and probably not be affected very much, assuming it doesn't get a disease. So here we have a monocot stem on the left and a dicot on the right. Notice how the vascular tissue is just underneath the bark, the living vascular tissue. This is a very young stem in both slides. But right underneath the bark of a dicot, think of a dicot for a moment. I've talked about a couple. Let's think of a young oak tree. It could be a maple, it could be an elm, it could be a young shrub for that matter, but let's say a young dicot tree, like an oak tree. If I were to hit that bark with that weed whacker like I did the palm, what could happen? Yeah, you may have heard the term girdling. So that could be very damaging to a tree and outright kill it. So now you know a little something about plants and how they move some things around. Now these vascular tissue do various things. They're designed to either move water from the roots up to the top of the plant or the food primarily downward to the root system. There's names for the vascular tissue. Lumpers, sorry, it's important to know this. Splitters, I know this is a great thing for you. Xylem, X-Y-L-E-M, not Zexlium or whatever you want to say. Xylem, kind of like Xerox, that X is a Z. Xylem is the water-carrying vessels that move the water primarily upward from the roots to the stomates or the pores in the opening of on the surface of the leaves. Phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M, phloem, carries the sap, or the sugars that are produced in the leaves, and it moves it primarily downward to the root system. It also is moving hormones and some other things throughout the plant. It can work as a two-way street, but its primary movement is downward toward the roots. So xylem moves water up, and phloem moves food downward. And they're paired together in bundles or rings, as we have seen in the previous slide. Here's a large plant, hard to tell you what it is, probably a sequoia of some sort, but as long as that outer periphery of bark is intact and it isn't compromised by some fire or something like that, it can move water up and food down and keep this plant living for, who knows, decades more. This is where people don't understand that there can be hidden dangers in our landscape trees. As long as the conductive tissue is able to do what it's supposed to do, provide the water and nutrients to the plant, it could be very hollow in the center. And structural integrity of a tree like this could be in question, especially when we get those wind named events. I hate using the H word in this class, so we'll avoid it for now. So, the leaf. It's a flattened extension or portion of the stem. We never think of it as kind of an extension of a stem, but it is. And there's all sorts of names for the various types of leaves and the patterns that they are arranged in. For example, in the upper part of the slide here, you can see opposite. The leaves are opposite one another. Look at the one that says alternate. Notice how on the right hand side of the stem there's a leaf, but directly opposite there's an internode. So on the left hand side it kind of zigzags back and forth, as you can see. And there are all sorts of arrangements, sometimes whorled. They go, several leaves are attached in a very small area on the stem, or they kind of spiral upward in some cases. Leaves can be modified into various needle-like or scale-like features. Usually needles and scale-like modifications are a good indicator of drought tolerance. Think of those evergreen trees further north, especially in the winter. They still need water, but the water is generally frozen in the soil, so they conserve it very well by having modifications to with needles. And there's all sorts of different variations on the leaves from the lobing patterns and division. Some are shallow, some are palmate leaves, some are 3 palmate, 5 palmate, pinnate, etc., etc., etc. Lumpers, I know this is painful, but splitters, I know this is nirvana. Now, the shapes of the leaves can become very important for plant identification. You know, is it long and linear? Is it wide and squat? Is it heart shaped? Is it oval, elliptical, whatever? All those little nuances aid in identifying of plants. But as you can see here, I don't have leaves necessarily attached to the stem, so that could be very hard to tell if I have a leaf or a leaflet. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So, here we talked about this earlier about with the stylized diagram of a plant, but we have the nodes and the internodes, as you can see on the right hand picture, and we know we are at a node where the leaf attaches to the stem and there's a bud. You have to see a big fat bud. The lower left hand picture shows a leaf. Hard to tell what that plant is, it's a little out of focus, but you can see the big swollen bud at the stem. So I know that is the leaf being attached to the stem. Now there are all types of leaves on the planet Earth. Some are simple. So that upper picture, that leaf would attach to the stem, and I would know that was the entire leaf because I see a swollen bud like I did in the last picture. But look at the middle one. What looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 leaves is really not those aren't leaves. They're called leaflets. If I look down in the center where they're all attached, there is not a bud. Now keep on looking toward the right hand side of that middle picture and you can see there's a petiole, or we'll call it a stem here, but it's a petiole, the leaf stem. And if the branch were in the picture, which it is not, I would know that that was a whole leaf, all 7 of those leaflets, when I see the stem and there's a bud right at the base. So what would splitters? What happens if someone were to pick off one of those leaflets and say, what is it? You wouldn't even know if you had a leaf or a leaflet. Splitters, isn't that painful? Lumpers, you're probably going, oh, when's he going to get to the next slide? But we have simple leaves, we have compound leaves, that middle one. They can be palmately compound. Put your hand in front of you with your thumb kind of pointing up. That's palmate. Looks like your palm or your hand, kind of like the picture. Pinnate would look more like a feather, like a bird feather. And you can also have doubly compound leaves. Oh, here's the bud. What was I going to say here? Oh, here we go. So here is in the upper left-hand picture, we have a pinnately compound leaf because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 leaflets. And in between those leaflets that are paired opposite one another, there is no bud. As it says in the picture, you can see no bud. But until I get to the stem, and there's a petiole, I can see the swollen bud. If someone needs that plant identified, we have to have the leaves, not leaflets, leaves attached to the stem. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, we also need the reproductive structures. And if it's a non-flowering plant, that would be a cone, or spores in ferns, or flowers or fruit in the flowering plants. So that one compound leaf on the left, that's pinnate. The one on the right on the upper picture is palmately compound. And the lower picture is which one, pinnate or palmate? Think about it a minute. That's pinnately compound leaf. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pairs of leaflets, and there's a terminal leaf at the tip on the left hand side of that picture. So sometimes it'll say in the diagnostics or keying out of these plants X number of pairs of leaflets for a particular species of a pecan or a walnut or something like that. This looks to be some kind of a walnut. Kind of hard to tell without the reproductive structures though, isn't it? Ah, splitters. This is where it gets great. What you see here is not a compound leaf, but a double compound leaf or doubly compound leaf. So what you're looking here is one leaf in this picture. So you can see there's a whole cluster of various leaflets attached to what appears to be the stem. But if I were to go to the base of that, where all those pinnate doubly compound leaflets are attached, there's no bud. I'd have to trace it down closer to where that ruler, near about the 3 3/4 mark, that would have to be the stem of the plant, and there would be a swollen bud right at about the 3.5 inch mark on that particular picture. Then I would know I have the entire leaf. So if somebody were to pick off one of those leaflets, you wouldn't know if you had a compound leaf or a double compound leaf. I know, for those that are lumpers, this is painful, but it's very important for plant identification when we get these kind of things into the office, whether to know we have a leaf or leaflets. Because without all the information, we may not be able to get very far other than to say, it's a plant, it's green, probably a flowering plant at that too. Yes, that's frustrating. As I talked about a little bit earlier, needles and scales are modifications, and sometimes needles are grouped in pairs or in bundles. Like I was saying, needles are modification of leaves, and they can be in various bundles. Sometimes they're 3 to a cluster, 2. Sometimes they have pegs at the bottom, other little minute structures that we don't really worry about so much in Florida because we don't have a lot of these here. But further north we would, and if you go back to visit and people ask, you can be some of these tiny minutiae that makes a difference between one species versus another species, or if they can identify it closer to the cultivar level. But usually, as we've kind of alluded to, that's pretty hard to identify plants down definitively to the cultivar level. So, the roots. They do not possess nodes or internodes or buds. So, they don't have any of that. Their function is primarily in supporting the plant, keeping it rooted into the ground and from blowing over, hopefully during high wind events. And they will uptake the water and the minerals that are dissolved in solution. Roots will grow both in length and diameter if it's a dicot or dicotyledonous dicotyledonous plant. Now think about this. Let's go to a maple tree. I plant a maple tree right by the driveway. And then a few years later I go, the maple tree is damaging the concrete. Could we have predicted that knowing it was a dicot to begin with? Absolutely. So in these very narrow, like those parking lot islands that we see everywhere when we park our cars and go around grocery shopping and big box stores, they try to shoehorn in a oak tree, a dicot, with roots that are going to grow in length and diameter. What do you think is going to happen to the island or the parking lot? Eventually the concrete or blacktop will start to buckle and cave and be damaged by that. What would be a better choice? You thinking about it a minute? Monocots, they'll grow in length, but they don't grow in diameter. So palm trees are monocots. So putting a palm tree in those small parking lot islands or near a driveway, it'll grow in length, but it'll be the same diameter right at the base of the palm tree as will be 20-30 feet away from the plant. Wow, it's good to know some of these divisions, huh, splitters and lumpers? Most of our plants, trees, shrubs, etc., generally grow between 2 and 3 times the diameter of the top. You may have seen a book in your readings over the years that show that plant roots stop right at what is called the drip line and are as deep as a plant is tall, or like a mirror image. You even may have read that somewhere. Truth of the matter is most of our trees and shrubs have their root system in the upper couple of feet of soil only. Even very large trees have it within only 2 to 3 feet of the top of the soil. That's because they need air to survive. So as a result, they like it where the oxygen is highest. So no, the trees aren't having their roots come to the surface to cause damage to concrete. This is just where they naturally live. We just have to live with that and plan accordingly when we're selecting plants. Again, roots need both water and air to survive, just like us. Now here's an adaptation to low oxygen environments. As you can see, it's probably a bald cypress. Could be a pond cypress, but it's kind of large, so I'm going with its cousin, the bald cypress, different species of Taxonomy. And you can see right by the water's edge and a little bit beyond that the plant has produced what is called pneumatophores. That's with a PN, like pneumatic drill, pneumonia. Those are what I like to call plant snorkels. This area of the where the tree was planted or has grown naturally, it floods from time to time, or that water rises up. Those roots still need oxygen, so the plant produces these structures, like a snorkel, to get that oxygen down to the root system. Now, knowing that it only does it where it's inundated from time to time or constantly wet, you could safely put in a bald cypress in sandy soil, not near any water source like that, and it'll never produce these. We have its cousin, the pond cypress, right out front, and it has never produced a pneumatophore. It's in a parking lot with very shallow soil that's really sandy. It's hot and dry. No need for that. Then there's something called adventitious roots. If you've ever been down to Thomas Edison's home in Fort Myers, I think it's Fort Myers, he has a banyan tree planted there. It's very, very old, and the tree keeps on spreading its branches very far out, and to support its weight, it sends down these roots as props. It's also kind of a way to propagate itself, I suppose, in nature. Now, adventitious, obviously, it's taking advantage of a situation. We do this as gardeners when we make cuttings. You take a plant stem, you cut it to the appropriate length at the right time. You may even use a plant hormone to stimulate the roots even faster or better. And now we have rooting from a plant that didn't have roots up in the air because it took advantage of what we did, or we took advantage of it, however you wish to think about that. Root hairs. Here's where all the action's at when it comes to absorbing water and nutrients. We think of the big branches as being, or big roots as the one absorbing the water. Those big roots are primarily designed to hold up the plant, whether it's a tree or shrub. But these small, fine wisp-like extensions off of the root, which is really an extension of a cell. So each of those little wisps is attached to is an extension of a cell. There are probably several hundred in this photograph alone. And these little find little fissures in the soil and little nooks and crannies. It also helps hold the plant down, yes. But this is where the water and nutrient absorbing is really happening. What happens when you transplant a tree and you cut off most of those fine root hairs and all you're left with are big heavy woody roots? What do you think is the chance of survival on something like that? That's right, generally pretty poor, because most of the root system has been left in the ground. Generally speaking, I don't recommend people transplant trees and shrubs from their yard that have been in there for a while, just for this reason alone. Now here's a concept you may or may not have heard of, mycorrhizae. It's a fungus. Now when you hear fungus, a lot of people start panicking, the sky is falling. But again, there's lots of beneficial fungi. Anyone ever have blue cheese? One of my favorites. And the stinkier it is, the better it is, isn't it? For those aficionados, Now some of you are getting grossed out by that, but sorry, that's just the nature of the creature. But a lot of fungi are beneficial to us. Think of yeast. That's really a fungus. We harness that to make breads. And I add flavor to breads as well. So mycorrhizae is an association, a symbiotic association. Symbiosis means two organisms living together in harmony, kind of like you and your spouse, or significant other, or boyfriend or girlfriend. You're in a symbiotic relationship. You are, aren't you? Well, I hope so. Anyhow, digressing, mycorrhizae, these are naturally occurring fungi in the soil, and they associate themselves with the plant. So what's the happy marriage here? Well, the plant produces a home for the fungus in the root system. As a result, the plants grow bigger. As you can see, the three plants on the right-hand side were put in a soil that had a fungal, the mycorrhizae. The ones on the left were put in sterilized potting soil. You can kind of see the turning of the roots a little bit. They were grown in pots in a greenhouse. But again, the trees that don't have the symbiotic relationship aren't as thrifty. I contend most plants have some kind of association in the roots with either a fungus or a bacteria. It's kind of like our gut genome and microflora. We don't really think about that, and it's kind of a gross subject, but the truth of the matter is, without those symbiotic bacteria in our GI tract, we couldn't absorb some of the key nutrients that we need to grow and survive. Then we have I mentioned mycorrhizae. Here's kind of a different picture of it in a little bit higher resolution. But you can see where the root system is and how it's been extended out even further because of the fungal association this particular plant has in its root system. Now, not all associations are fungal. Some are bacterial. Now, if you've ever heard that legumes, bean, pea, the family Fabaceae, the legume family, fixes atmospheric nitrogen. This is true, but it's not really the plant that's doing the work. It's the bacterium that is in the root system. Sometimes we purposely inoculate the bean and pea family members. If you've ever gone to a garden center and covered your sweet peas with a black powder and then planted them, you inoculate them with a particular bacterium in hopes that this association will be better boosted in your particular soil. If you look at the roots on the right-hand side, you'll see what appears to be a whole bunch of problematic areas, all those spheres. Notice the word I use, spheres. Those spheres are loaded with a certain particular species of bacterium. A rhizobium is usually the particular genus of bacterium that it associates with. Maybe not always. But notice that they're spherical or round. Although this picture doesn't show it quite well, each of those spheres is attached to the root of this legume by a small little, what I like to call, umbilical cord. So what has happened? The plant, in association with the bacterium, made a little home, a round little spherical home for the bacterium to live happily and do its thing. What is the plant getting in return? The bacterium is able to take nitrogen from the air and fix it, and then it returns it back to the particular plant during the growing season. Now, some of you may have used legumes. Various legume species are used throughout the world and the country as cover crops to fix some nitrogen during the off season of cropping. Usually that nitrogen is lost over the course of time before we crop the next year, but it does help build up the organic matter in the soil. That's another topic for another time, however. So what's a stem versus roots? A stem consists of nodes and internodes. We've already talked about that earlier in this class. But there are all sorts of modifications to stems. Look at the onion on the upper right-hand picture. That is actually a stem that you're cutting into and eating. Never thought of it. A lot of you probably thought it was a bulb. But when you peel the onion layers apart, that is a leaf. And what's that space in between called? The leaf. The internode. And then you peel it, the node, the internode. You get it? Yep. So that is a modification of a stem. A corm, in this case, that could be like a gladiola, is another modification. It's short, thickened, fleshy. We usually don't eat these, but again. The upper right hand picture, next time you go to the grocery store and you see ginger or you see its cousin turmeric, they're in the same family, they're the ginger family, you'll see that's a modified stem. If you look closely, you'll kind of see lines going around the finger or hand of ginger here. Where that line is, that is the node. Then look over to either right or left of that and you'll see another line. That's another node. So what's the space in between called? That's correct, an internode. So knowing this, you can take a piece of ginger, and as long as you have 2 or 3 nodes roughly, break it apart, let that cut area dry overnight or a couple of days, you can propagate more ginger from the ones you go to the grocery store. And that's asexual reproduction, so you'll get a copy of the parent and all its particular characteristics that it was selected for, whether it was taste, ease of growth, or whatever. Now, here's a modification of the stem called a tuber, the lower picture, or a potato. And we know there's all sorts of potatoes. There's baking potatoes and russet Burbanks, and we have purple potatoes and Yukon Gold and all that kind of stuff. If you look at that carefully, where the eye is, that is a node. And where the space between to the next eye is called a internode. So for you gardeners who have taken potatoes and cut them into 2 or 3 pieces, as long as you have a couple of eyes, let that cut area dry for a day or two to wax over, or suberize is another term. And then you can plant it, and you're cloning the russet Burbank if that's what it is. Russet Burbank is a potato cultivar that is asexually reproduced or cloned and has been for over 100 and some odd years. So we keep on maintaining that cultivar asexually. Here's a side note. Grab a potato sometime and at the tip where you first spot the first node with a marker or a pencil, go around to the next node. If you're really careful, you'll realize it goes in a spiral. I just don't recommend you eat it if you eat the peel if you used a magic marker. That'll conclude part 2 of Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener. Stay tuned for several more modules of Botany and Taxonomy right after this. Really?